So, the basic biology lesson we all got about recessive genes.
Mm-hmm. The one where you need 2 copies for the condition to show up.
Exactly. And if you just carry one copy, say, for certain intellectual disabilities, you're fine, no effect, like completely unaffected.
That's definitely the standard understanding. Yeah, carriers were just carriers. The gene was considered silent in them.
Right. Well, hold on to your hats, because there's this new genetic discovery that's really challenging that whole idea.
Okay.
It seems that carrying even one of these silent recessive genes, the ones linked to intellectual disabilities, might actually mean something.
Mean what, though?
It looks like carriers might, on average, have fewer children.
Fewer children. Wow, okay, that is unexpected.
Isn't it? Something we all thought had zero effect now, potentially linked to,
Yeah.
well, reproductive success.
And that's exactly what grabbed our attention in that De Morgan article. The headline basically says, "New genetic discovery refutes old biology lesson. Carriers of recessive gene have fewer children."
Yeah. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack this, look at the finding, the evidence, and, why it's causing geneticists to sort of rethink things.
Let's get into it. So where did this start? What was the clue?
Well, it wasn't some sudden eureka moment, apparently. It came from a clinical geneticist, Han Brunner. He noticed something off.
Off how?
He saw that these recessive intellectual disabilities just weren't appearing as often as the genetic math predicted, like 3 times fewer cases than expected.
Interesting. So the real-world numbers didn't match the theoretical predictions based on inheritance patterns.
Exactly. It's like the sums didn't quite add up.
And Brunner didn't just ignore that discrepancy.
No, he developed this hypothesis. He thought, well, maybe the carriers, the people with just one copy who seem fine, maybe they're slightly less successful at passing on their genes.
So fewer children per carrier could, over time, lead to fewer people being born with the actual condition.
Precisely. He even did a rough calculation, suggesting maybe just a 1% reduction in kids per carrier could explain that threefold difference he was seeing.
Wow. 1% sounds so small.
It does.
But I guess across a whole population, millions of carriers. Maybe those tiny effects compound.
That seems to be the idea. Still, it really pushes against what we thought we knew, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Professor Jesse Santen, quoted in the article, he wasn't involved in the research, basically said this goes against a very basic principle.
Yeah, the idea that carrier status for a recessive gene just doesn't matter for the carrier's own traits or life. That's been the paradigm.
Exactly. The assumption was neutrality. Total neutrality for the carrier. This finding flips that on its head.
So how did Brenner test this? You need solid data for such a counterintuitive idea.
Right. The article mentions he and his team analyzed a huge British medical database. We're talking nearly 380,000 people.
Wow, almost 500,000.
Yeah, a massive sample size. And that's crucial, To detect potentially very subtle effects like this, you need those big numbers.
To make sure it's not just noise or random chance.
Precisely, to get statistical significance.
Okay, so they crushed the numbers on these 380,000 people. What did they find? This is the core of it, right?
It is, and the key finding was pretty stark. Individuals who carried a mutation in one of 363 specific recessive genes linked to intellectual disability, were 3 times more likely to be childless.
3 times compared to people without those mutations.
Yes, 3 times more likely to have no children. That's not subtle when you frame it like that.
No, it really isn't. It's direct evidence challenging that old biology lesson.
Yeah.
So the big question then is, why? Why would carriers have fewer children?
Well, Brunner's team looked deeper and found another potential link.
Okay.
They found that carriers of the 118 most impactful mutations in that group also had, on average, 4 years less education.
4 years less education.
Okay, so there's a correlation between carrying these specific gene variants and educational attainment.
Exactly. And that offers a possible mechanism, doesn't it? It might not be the gene directly affecting fertility. Right, but maybe it subtly influences something else, like cognitive function or related factors, which then impacts education.
Which then potentially links to socioeconomic factors. The article connects this to sociological research, suggesting that lower educational attainment, especially for men, can sometimes make it harder to find a partner and consequently have children.
Ah, I see. So it's potentially an indirect effect. Gene influences trait, trait influences social outcomes influence reproduction. It's complex.
Very complex. It's not a simple cause and effect like the gene causes childlessness. It's more like a ripple effect through various aspects of life.
And Brunner himself seems to frame it quite carefully. He suggests the impact of having just one copy might be very slight, like maybe knocking a few points off an IQ score, say 5 points.
Okay.
Now, for someone starting with a high IQ, that difference might be, negligible in daily life.
Right. Wouldn't make much difference.
But he suggests for someone whose IQ is already lower, that same small reduction could potentially have a bigger impact on, say, finishing school, finding stable work, participating fully in society.
That makes sense. The functional impact of a small change might depend heavily on the starting point. It's a nuanced perspective.
Yeah. And Professor Santon, the outside expert, seems quite taken with the research. He calls it extraordinary and eye-opener.
High praise indeed. He suggests it could really explain that long-standing puzzle, why these recessive conditions are rarer than expected.
It sounds like this study is making some serious waves in the genetics community.
It seems so. But Santon also adds a really critical piece of caution,
Which is?
that this effect, while statistically significant across a huge population, is subtle at the individual level. It doesn't mean you, if you're a carrier, are destined to have fewer kids.
Right. It's a population trend, not an individual prediction. Most carriers will likely have families just like anyone else.
Exactly. It's about probability shifting slightly across hundreds of thousands of people, not a personal fortune-telling device. That's a key distinction.
Absolutely. So what does this mean for things like genetic screening? The article mentions the Dutch Health Council is looking into broader screening for prospective parents.
Yeah, that's a hot topic. But Brunner himself sounds quite skeptical about screening everyone for carrying single copies of these specific genes,
Why is that?
because the individual impact is likely so small. He doesn't seem to think population-wide screening for this particular finding is warranted or likely to happen. The cost-benefit just might not add up for such a subtle effect.
Okay, so this discovery probably won't lead to immediate changes in broad carrier screening policies.
Probably not for these specific subtle effects. Of course, we already have targeted genetic testing and counseling for families with known risks.
Right, things like PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing for couples who know they carry the same mutation for a severe condition. That's different.
Very different. That's about preventing a known high probability of a serious disorder. This new finding is about a subtle statistical effect on carriers themselves.
The article also sort of glances at the commercial side of things, embryo selection for complex traits, which many experts are pretty dubious about.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. Predicting complex traits from genes is way harder and often based on shakier science than testing for single gene disorders. Best to be cautious there.
Definitely. But back to Brenner, it sounds like this discovery was a long time coming for him, a decade of wondering about this puzzle.
It really does. The article conveys his satisfaction at finally finding a potential explanation for this missing group, this discrepancy he observed years ago. It's a testament to scientific persistence.
Absolutely. So let's try and sort of nail down the main point here from this De Morgan piece. The big takeaway is that carrying just one copy of certain recessive genes, the ones linked to intellectual disability, isn't necessarily neutral. It seems to be associated statistically with having fewer children and potentially lower educational attainment.
Right. It fundamentally challenges that old, very basic biology lesson that carrier status has no consequence for the carrier.
It really does. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you listening.
Mm-hmm.
If these genes, which we thought were completely silent in carriers, can actually have these subtle, unforeseen ripple effects, well, what else might be going on beneath the surface?
That's a great question. What other silent aspects of our biology might have hidden influences on our lives, our societies that we're only just starting to uncover?
Yeah. How does this new understanding maybe shift our perspective on genetics, on inheritance, and even on those big population trends we observe?
It certainly suggests the relationship between our genes and our life outcomes is probably far more intricate, more complex than we ever realized. Lots to think about,